our karakia. So, Brent?
Tuatahi tēnā koe, Kataraina, koutou ko te whānau, e maune I ngā kakahau tarata, e te wehenga o tō kāna ki tua o Pairo. Just before I start the karakia, I just wanted to express the heartfelt condolences of us all here for the loss of your sister, Kataraina. Nō reira e kui haere. Haere ki o tupuna, haere ki o mātua, maumara I ngā ringa atawhai o te wahinaru. Kia ora. Tēnā tātou te hunga ora. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kinakina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atukura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu, te hei Māori ora.
Thank you, Brent, for those nice words. Okay, so I've got a piece of paper that's got some things on it, and I've got another piece of paper over here. There's something totally different. So I'm going to stick to Dave's paper. So first one up is health and safety. I don't believe we need to know that, only because we've been in this chamber so often, and if we don't know the health and safety rules by now, we certainly have a problem. But in saying that, if there is any questions around our health and safety of today, I'm quite happy to open it up for that. If not, I'm happy to move on. All good with our health and safety, Koto? Yeah. Apologies. So far, I have Clyde. Clyde is an apology. I'd like to move that apology. And someone second, please. Okay. I can't see anybody against it, but carriage. Confirmation of agenda. I do believe that we have all been advised of item 6.1 being left off today due to the illness of our presenters, and Brent has advised that it will be back on the next agenda. Other than that, if anybody is planning, they need to have something put up forward before the way it's sorted now. Happy to discuss that. Otherwise, I'm happy to move again. If someone would like to second our agenda, please. Thank you, Ben. This disclosures of interest, I do believe that all disclosures of interest are taken and put through the system. So if there's nothing, the only disclosure of interest I need today is anything that might pertain to what is on our agenda. I'm happy to take your disclosure of interest on the subject when we get there. Ka pai tēnā? Otherwise, anything else that belongs to WRC, you will need to send it in some stage to Dave so he can put it forward. Do we need that moved as well, David?
No.
Nope. Okay. Ka pai tēnā, ka huri? Mai. Our first agenda is 6.2 on page 13. Kia ora, Jack.
So just a couple of moments. So each committee agenda, Jack, you'll be familiar with Jack now, gives you a bit of an update of where things are at. This paper is giving you a picture over the entirety of the past year in terms of our compliance work and our consented space. The previous paper would have been giving you that same picture over the work that we do in our proactive monitoring space, but as Kataraina has identified, the presenters unavailable today.
Yep.
So with that, just to hand over to Jack. Welcome.
Jack, are you happy to have questions as we go along, or do you want to wait till the end?
Feel free to throw questions at me as they come in.
Okay, ka pai tēnā.
Kia ora koutou. Right, can we go next slide, please? So as Brent mentioned, this is an annual report looking back over the period 1st of July 2023 through to 30th of June 2024. And it's a summary of our compliance monitoring and enforcement work undertaken by our resource consent monitoring teams. So they sit within our resource consent section under Ana Maria. And have a very specific focus on monitoring and enforcement in relation to consented sites. So this is a breakdown of the work that we currently have on. So there's 1,300, give or take, resource consents across the region. And that's spread across 2,800 sites that we actively monitor. There's a number of consents, roughly 5,000, and about 2,000 sites that aren't actively monitored. And those are things like land use consents. It may be a culvert that's installed 20 years ago, or a stream diversion that's been in place for a very long time, and there's no ongoing monitoring required. So for the ones we do actually monitor, this is a breakdown in the different activity types. So agriculture and horticulture are kind of one of our two biggest groups. So that's all kind of farming and horticultural activities. And from a resource consent monitoring perspective, it's about the water takes on those sites. So that makes about 600 sites in total, and then which are just for water takes. And there are a number of other activities on those properties, like farm dairy effluent, which are managed by our rural compliance team, except where there's a little bit of crossover for efficiency, so that the property owners and are not seeing council twice.
Before you go too far, what is domestic effluent?
So that is everything from its on-site domestic effluent system. So if you're not connected to the reticulated network, you'll have an old septic system, or a new disposal field, or something like that. So where we've got 300, the majority of those, about 200, are within the Taupo catchment. So that's currently the only catchment where small residential houses are required to have one. Outside of that catchment, most houses will fall under our permitted activity rule, and it's only very large houses, commercial operations like campgrounds, or our burgeoning retirement industry, which also have disposal systems.
So that I'm going to expect that Marae is inclusive in this. So do you do monitoring of these so-called rural domestic effluents often? So damn sure I don't see you use that Marae.
Yeah, so we don't get around them that often. They're quite small systems, so the risk from them as individual sites is fairly low. But you can see they're one of our biggest groups. So cumulatively, they have a big effect, especially where they're located around sensitive areas. So townships around estuaries and coastal settlements, where because it all on-site systems discharge into the ground and then the groundwater. So if you're near waterways, shallow lakes, and estuarine systems without good flushing, if they're not managed appropriately, you can see some effects there. So we prioritize them that way.
Thank you.
Our next biggest group is structures. So we've got both inland structures, which are dams, wharves, jetties, and power pylons in Lake Karapiro, that kind of thing. We've got about 300 of those, and then about 300 coastal structures, 200, sorry, which are our rock walls, jetties, marinas, same kind of thing, but in the coastal environment. So those bigger groups, we've got lots of them, but they're generally a lower priority, so we don't get around them as often. And I'll touch a little bit on how our approach to those has changed over this last year. Next slide, please. So this is in September last year, we presented to the committee on our new strategy. This is the first full year we've had it implemented. And I thought it'd be important to touch base on some of the key changes to that and how we've seen that come through in our work this year. So our strategy aims to provide a more adaptable approach to CME to allow our officers to be flexible in where we put our effort and what we monitor and respond to changes throughout the year, whether those are economic, climatic, so Cyclone Gabriel events or droughts, and really be able to get those best outcomes for the environment with what we're doing. In supporting that, we've got a lot of our data in much more reportable formats, so we're able to interrogate it more. We can look on catchment scale. We can look at state of the environment data to target under pressure catchments and look at non-compliance and compliance levels within those, and look at historical drought patterns if we're thinking about potential low flow interventions. And what comes along with that greater data is being able to use that to be proactive with our work. So it's not just about waiting until something happens. We want to be looking for where we're going to have issues and front-footing it, putting that effort in as at the front before there's an issue saves us a huge amount of time, and we're able to spread our effort and do a lot more. And then the other end of it is focusing on reducing serious and repeat non-compliance. So these are offenders who are either having a very large environmental impact or an ongoing non-compliance or a disregard for their resource consent, which is their commitment to the community and to us on what they're going to do. Next, please. So some of our key changes, increase engagement with consent holders. So this starts with the basics. When you get a new consent, our officers will be in touch. We'll be talking you through it, making sure you understand your obligations and what you can expect from us, and really building that relationship from day one. And then we move into some more technical engagement as well. So we're looking at our drought forecasts. We're looking at weather forecasts. We're engaging with our key operators to make sure they know what conditions might be coming up and their obligations should we go into low flows, or what we expect, say, wastewater treatment plant operators to do in advance of wet weather events, and then what their potential for emergency powers might be during those events, and how to manage that through. And we've found there's just a greater understanding of the risks and how to mitigate them when we put that effort in. Increasing site visits and physical inspections as well. So again, it's about getting out there, being seen, talking to our consent holders, building that relationship, and then using that to influence better outcomes. So your question about domestic effluent systems. So this is where our we've called it campaign monitoring. So large groups of low impact sites where under a normal prioritization approach, they would be so far down the scale, our resource wouldn't allow us to get to them. But when we look at them as a, when we look at them as a group, they can have an outsized impact, especially in those sensitive catchments. So what we're doing is we're looking at those large groups, we're looking at the sensitive catchments and identifying what we need to be doing on a year-to-year basis. So they may not be monitored every single year, but we'll make sure that we have a risk-based approach over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on what's needed, to make sure that risk is being adequately managed and not just forgotten about or deprioritized every single year until something goes wrong.
If a wastewater treatment plant is decommissioned, what monitoring do we put into place for ensuring that the land is going back to being good for use in some other section? And how long does it take for the land to become usable for maybe dairy use or whatever?
Yeah, so maybe going from a disposal field to growing your gardens or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah, it really depends on the type of waste that's being disposed, how long, and the soil type.
Right.
So when we're granting consents, they're assessed on managing that impact so that the soil and the integrity of the soil is maintained at where it should be. So if those consents are complied with, and in an ideal world, you'd just be looking at that there should be minimal changes to the receiving environment once that activity has ceased. If you're looking at grown vegetables in your formal wastewater patch, there might be a few soil tests and things you might want to look at.
Okay.
Jack, I wonder if the example of the Tuakau byproduct site, there might be a useful example for around how we deal with sites that have left, but they've left a wastewater system there.
Yeah. So the former Tuakau proteins plant used to be a rendering facility. So they'd take offal and byproduct from animal processing, freezer works, animal processing plants, and turn it into proteins and tallow. When they had a major fire in 2019 and burnt down, the site effectively ceased to operate, but they had all that infrastructure there. So they have huge ponds, 10,000 cubic meters of storage. All of the effluent that was currently in them at the time, that was pumped out, removed, and irrigated under the consents that they do have, or sent to wastewater. But you're still left with ponds have a tendency to leak. So there could have been contaminated ground underneath that. That site is currently going through a revitalization, I guess, and being turned into, I believe it's a housing development. So those ponds are being decommissioned. And part of the development works on site through a district council consent that they have is around managing that soil contamination based on previous land use. So they have to test and come up with a remedial action plan, clean up the site, and then test to confirm that it is safe for the intended use. And there's different levels of contaminants that are permitted for different activities. If we were going back to an agricultural activity, you'd be allowed higher levels of heavy metals and things like that in the within the soils. But if you're going for a residential land use with gardens, then there's a much stricter regime, and it has to be demonstrated. And that's so that process around contaminated soils and land use for exposure to human health is a district council responsibility. But we, as regional council, maintain a register of all those properties that may be affected, so that we can keep a track of how they're being managed longer term. So we've got a finger in the pie a little bit.
Thank you.
And then the last one is just sediment and erosion control workshops is something that our council has done for a number of years. This year we've expanded it a little bit, and we've got greater engagement. And it's kind of a key one for us in making sure that people undertaking the activities in a certain industry have the required skills and knowledge to do it safely and in an environmentally friendly way. It also gives us a really good opportunity to get in front of the people doing it when we're not, turning up as an inspector at their site. It's a much better forum for them to build a bit of trust with us and for us to share knowledge and better ways of working. And that's something we're looking at our options, I guess, to expand out into other industries because it's had such a meaningful impact in erosion and sediment control.
Can you give me an example around who has benefited out of your workshop for erosion and sediment control for industry operators? Because in my head, I can see a whole lot of industries already who have over many years, for instance, Fonterra, a couple of factories, industries who have caused sediment and erosions in the areas they're in. Just like one or two that might have worked out quite well.
Yeah.
For our erosion and sediment control
Hawaii,
workshops.
who are you? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Ko Kara 3 Tokuingawa. I'm a consent monitoring team leader here. Sit on the earthworks and the land development, quarry and mine monitoring things.
Excellent.
So our team's responsible for delivering the erosion and sediment control workshops. It's quite a range of an audience that we're able to attract. bigger operators and really small firms,
Okay.
right up to the consultants, the Beckers, the WSPs of the world, who are putting their engineers, or especially their designers, through training like this. There are also a number this year who have come along from different district councils as well.
Right.
And we've had some landfill operators too. Over the years, it's been really people in that space. And yeah, I guess what we're wanting to consider is whether or not there's similar opportunities within other industries as well. What I will say about the erosion sediment control workshops, they've been running for a very long time,
Yeah.
almost 20 years with WRC. They're very well known with the industry. Pay per place, costs are covered that way. And for any new initiatives like that, finding a way for the industry to be able to fund us doing that work and delivering these skills for them is a really important factor.
As long as it's working, because I know for a fact, I can mention 2 places now that erosion has been quite, and it's to do with quarry work. I can also mention one of those quarries who ended up having to divert a stream, so I wondered how much these workshops are helping. Ka pai tēnā.
So
It's
if I just
okay.
add a little bit to what Gareth just said, one of the workshops have been so successful over the years because there's a gap in the market for training. And so if you're an earthworks contractor and you want to train your staff, where can you go? This is a place that they can go. And that's why it's been so successful and fully funded by the industry, because all the work that we do is fully funded because they need this training opportunity. And so as Gareth's identifying, we're sort of working with industries. Are there other opportunities? One of the things that we've always found a challenge in the earthwork space over the years is awareness of what the obligations are. And so people will go out and do things because there's a lot of work that can be done in the earthwork space as a permitted activity. So how do people become aware of what those obligations are? And there are still some out there, as you're identifying, Katarina, who don't reach out, even though the opportunity is there, to understand what the obligations are. And so one of the challenges has always been, how do we reach those that are hard to reach, to have them come through so that they understand those obligations as well. But like I say, it's been very successful. So sorry, Robbie.
Thank you. Robbie.
Carry on from what you just said there, Brent. I think you most probably need to put it on their governance table, because they're the ones responsibility for the fines anyway if they don't take. So you need to put it on some of the board tables of some of those major companies that you're talking about, that this is, and these are the mitigating factors that you can do to keep yourself out of that space. That's a pretty easy place to put it.
Historically, it's been the one person operations that have been our struggle to get to. The people
I'm going to bring that up in a second. Yeah. So I was running up the uptake of Matamata Piako and KARAKIA into this, because there's definitely in the last 18 months they've been asking to be able to do this erosion and settlement works. There's been several contractors that have been put in court and fined, and there was great worry down there that the knowledge base of some of those contractors have been doing it for 40 years, and still they were, because they hadn't done the course, had got themselves into this legal hole, because I'm not, so that's where I'm going. I want to know the uptake. And also, this is a requirement for anyone that does work for us to do the course. Why is that not?
It's not a requirement for them to do work for us. This is for people who we're regulating via resource consents, or who are undertaking work as a permitted activity. So anyone has the opportunity to do that.
If I grab that, it's a good point, Robbie, and I'll mention that through. I think what Robbie's alluding to, Gareth, is people who are contracted by our ICM team to do earthworks, and so it's a good point, Robbie. I'll share that with Greg, whether or not it's part of the expectations of contractors working for ICM to have gone through this course.
I truly understood. I thought they did. That's why I just brought that up. Yeah.
I'd be surprised if they aren't aware of this good practice, but it's a good thing to follow up. Thanks, Robbie.
And definitely a lot of the attendees who do come along, these companies who do support this, they're wanting to do that so they can say, we have sent X number through this type of training when they're bidding for those jobs, not necessarily the WRC ones, but when they're bidding for other work, especially government, district council work, central government work.
Yeah, thank you. But I understand, I'm pretty sure the Thames Valley drainage, if you haven't done this course, you cannot clean drains on behalf of Thames Valley drainage. I think that's the rule, but I may be wrong, but it needs to be cleared up.
Kia ora. Thank you, Gareth. Maybe we should add into some of your contractors that a criteria is that you have done some sort of erosion sediment control workshop. You never know, it might help. But anyway, ka pai tēnā. Jack, Komotu, are you finished or you got some more to go? Yep, go. Yep.
Very much. So this slide looks at our compliance gradings from last year. Same graphic that's in the paper. So we look at compliance both on a site level and a site maybe say a Fonterra dairy factory. That's one site when we're reporting it like that. But it'll have a number of consents for air discharge, wastewater, domestic effluent systems, and stormwater. So it's important for us to look at both the number of sites and their compliance level, and then the consents within them and how that breakdown works. You can see it's a fairly similar distribution of compliance across the two, with a reasonably high level of consents that are in non-compliance. But a lot of those are in that low risk non-compliance, which is of a technical nature. So of late submission of reporting or missing one sample out of 12 or something like that. When we're looking at environmental impacts, it's the moderate and significant non-compliance, which are our orange and our red up there. And those are our what we term to be serious non-compliance and a key focus for us. So every year, our teams will go through the number of sites that we've gone. We'll look at the conditions and previous history and a number of factors, and we'll determine which ones are our highest priority for the year, and we'll set that as our target, our must-dos. We call those our focus area ones. And this year there were 451 focus area ones, and that's about half of the 875 sites that we monitored overall. So both of those are one of our highest ever number of sites monitored, highest ever number of consents monitored, and our highest focus area consents too, and sites. And part of that is around a better understanding of the work that we have, better identification at the start, and all that feeds back into that better data that we have sitting behind informing our monitoring work.
So what's our stance on non-compliance? For instance, I mean, a lot of consents, as much as they've been given out, sometimes we're on the wrong stage. They become either non-compliant because the person who's got the resource consent is not working to. So what's our stance if we decide that the consent is non-compliant? What's our stance?
Yeah, so in terms of our reaction to it, or what we do when we discover non-compliance. So it's very site-specific and case by case. No two options will, no two events will be the same. Even if it's exactly the same on different sites, you may have a different operator that has a different history or a different behaviour or a different response. So WRC has got an enforcement policy that looks at that range of factors, which includes environmental effect, potential environmental effect, behavior, history, sensitivity, and importance of the receiving environment. And from the consideration of all those factors, we determine what we're going to do about it. There will always be a direction to comply and to do the lawful thing as a basic minimum. But in terms of sanctions, it's probably that's on the extreme end. Most people want to comply. They just need to be helped or directed or enabled to be able to comply. And there are a number of things that are outside of their control that may result in non-compliance. So if we look at Cyclone Gabrielle, wet weather events, that was beyond the control of a lot of operators for a number of reasons, whether it's wastewater ponds or sediment controls that they could not really have been expected to plan for because it was so out of the ordinary, but they may still have resulted in either minor discharges or minor non-compliance with their resource consent. So that's whether it's something that they can do something about or should have been able to do something about is another thing that we consider when we're looking at that. I'll touch on our our formal enforcement, which is notices, abatement notices and fines later. But it's about, we did about 85 this year. So compared to the number of sites that are non-compliant, the number of sites that needed formal enforcement was relatively low. Most of them, we feel confident that we can get them back into compliance using other tools, direction, engagement.
So we try to help them to become compliant.
Yeah, 100%.
Because
Yeah.
through experience, I know that a lot of TAs, some of their wastewater treatment plants are way out of compliance. And they've been out for so long, it's not funny. So I think I can mention one now, but, where do we stand? How long do we allow them to be non-compliant? And I'm sure Brent knows who I'm talking about too. So I just wondered, because the difference between a TA, TLA and domestic is in non-compliance is very short. Yeah. You're so quick to, it seems to be so quick to go off with our domestic people, but our TLAs who looks after our people, we allow their non-compliance to go too long, in my perspective, especially around wastewater treatment plants. So I need to understand what it is that we do to ensure that they become compliant in a quicker time than us allowing them to go on forever.
Yeah, so there's a number of factors that kind of separate our approach and our response to municipal wastewater plants run by public bodies and commercial enterprises. So a commercial enterprise is there to make money. If we take a dairy factory, for example, again, if they have a non-complying wastewater treatment plant, we expect them to comply within a fairly immediate time frame, regardless of, and any time they spend continuing to operate in non-compliance is aggravating because they are doing it so that they can continue to make money most often, which is not. That's
wrong excuse.
That'll put you right at the top.
PLAs are making money too.
Yeah. Yeah, so with the TLA, it's an obligatory service. They have to provide wastewater, they have to provide drinking water, and they have to provide stormwater. It's not something they have a choice to do, and I'm sure if they did have a choice to do it, it might look a little different. And then the way that they're funded and the way that they're able to do the upgrades is different. It's public money, and often there's a consultation with how that money is spent, because we can be talking in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade these plants, which is not money that they have in operational budgets. It's not something, they can do tweaks and we expect them to do maintenance, but where you've got those systemic problems where ponds are just, or treatment plants are just not suitable for the population anymore and need that big upgrade, that's where we work much closely in with them, making sure they know their obligation to address that and to fix it, and that they're working through a set program of works, because it follows the same pattern. You scope your works, you engage with your community, get back from them what they would like, what they expect, and then what's a better environmental outcome, and then an implementation phase. And at every point of that, we are checking to make sure that they are on track.
Ian, you got a question?
Yeah, just
you've got your grade and not assessed. Now, presumably you've identified them as part of your need to survey. So why did they end up not assessed?
Yeah, so for our focus areas, our must-do, all of those were assessed with a grade. When we say not assessed, it's not that we haven't looked at them, it's that we're unable to give a grade. So it could be that we're missing a key piece of information, or the main activity for that site hasn't commenced. We've looked at a number of things. There may be some compliant, some non-compliant, but we don't want to give the wrong message and say this is your grade without having that full picture. So quite often with that not assessed, there'll be a number of actions that'll come with it, and there could even be enforcement action if that's something that we deem necessary.
Yeah, I wonder, Jack, in future that we might label that differently, because it does
Yeah.
present the image that we haven't looked, as opposed to we've looked, but there isn't justification for assigning a status, which yeah, maybe we'll have to think about that language to make that clearer for everybody.
Okay, Jack. Carry on.
Perfect.
Robbie?
And then
Robbie
next
has
slide.
a question.
Right.
So mitigating factors, how does that come into any of that discussion? Like imagine when you're doing compliance of a consent, but is mitigation of actually putting other blocks or barriers in place that contaminant can't go anywhere? Is that a part of that discussion in a consent process or not? Or just asking the question?
Yeah, so I guess with compliance gradings, we use Ministry for Environment gradings. They're fairly black and white. You either you've done what's in the condition or you haven't, and then the degree, and that makes you compliant or non-compliant, and then the degree of seriousness, whether there's environmental effects or serious environmental effects, pushes you into low risk, moderate, or significant. That's not something that we really have any discretion or anything on. Your grade is your grade. Where we take those mitigating factors into account as deciding what to do about it. So if there's been, say, a discharge or something like that, it'd be how they cleaned it up, how they responded to it, what measures they put in place to make sure it never happens again. There's all those kind of considerations that we look at, whether we want to go on a direction, so just telling them what we'd like them to do and a bit of a telling off, or a formal direction through an abatement notice or a fine or something more serious through the courts. And then when we're looking at the consent processing side of things, and when they're initially granted, they will look at that potential risk and put in place mitigating measures, treatment and wetland disposal and things like that, that form part of that consent and should be sufficient to manage the effects on the environment.
You don't look convinced?
I'm looking at mitigation that you can have if an accidental discharge happened, but actually you could still block the discharge from getting into a larger environment. That's the bit I'm trying to, that's mitigation, because that bit can easily be cleaned up without going into crossing your boundary and then discharging into someone else's property or whatever it is. So I think that needs to be looked at as, if there is an accidental discharge, keeping it on your property where you can contain it and do something about it is vital in those scenarios. And that's the bit is the council giving direction in that area, that accidents happen, but when you contain it on your property that can be managed and cleaned up easily, that is a lot better than trying to clean the contaminant up on someone else's property. Becomes a real serious issue.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, Robbie, is the front end stuff. When Anna Maria's team are doing the consenting work, if there's a risk that needs to be managed through contingency, that then relates to getting it into the consent contingent obligations, and then Jack's team do that compliance monitoring. We might need to move it along, Jack.
Yep. Next one, please. So these are the formal enforcement actions that our team took in the last year. So 29 formal warnings, 21 abatement notices, and 36 infringement notices. Now, most of these related to our section 15. So those are discharges to air, land, and water, which is where the majority of our work comes in. One of the big differences in this last year compared to 22-23 is much fewer formal enforcement actions for unlawful taking of water. And part of that is down to improved weather conditions. There's more water available, fewer low flow conditions, which is normally what people trip up on, but also increase engagement. So our teams have been out with those problem sites that are getting enforcement or non-compliance year after year, and just being out there, talking them through it and showing them what we want to do has seen some big benefits in that place too. And then, so next one, please. So last year was kind of our first annual report. This is our second one, so we're able to dive into some long-term trends. On the left are our repeat non-compliance. So those are sites that were moderate or significant, so our serious ones, the last time they were monitored, and then continue to be non-compliant in the next time they're monitored. So what we want to see is a nice reducing line to get that down to as near to zero as possible. We want sites that are having major issues to be addressing them as soon as possible, and not dragging on year after year, whether that's systemic issues or attitude, behavior, and investment need. We're using our tools, and I think that graph shows it effectively to reduce that number over time. And then our graph on the right shows the number of sites and the level of compliance that we've monitored in the previous 5 years. So we're working our way up, doing more and more every year as we build our team. We've had a really stable team this year with some good experience that we're able to get across a lot of it. Next, please. And then a couple of long-term trends as well. So on the left is our use of formal enforcement tools over the last 3 years, and how that's changed. So one of the ones I want to focus on is abatement notices. We're using them more often, more frequently, in a much more conservative way. So that's it could be a take action or a stop doing something that just gives us a bit of breathing room. It sets a standard for consent holders to comply with, and it really passes on the importance of the situation if it's a discharge or similar to be managed. And then on the right is our number of sites we've monitored month by month over the last 3 years. So another record number monitored this year. Figures are slightly different, so ignore that. But we're doing more and more, partly because we've got a full complement of officers, so we've got more people doing more sites, but we're also getting more efficient. So it's taking less time per site to monitor them on average throughout the year, and that's coming in with some of the improvements we're making across the team and efficiency. Next one, please. And then last one, just a summary of our key achievements. So 5% more sites monitored than last year, an increase of 20% of sites, and 5% of consents. Increase in the number of formal enforcement, so fines and notices. And then a couple of those really key ones that I spoke about earlier is a decrease in significant non-compliant sites and repeat non-compliant sites. And then one of the statistics that I think really speaks to how we're getting out there and engaging with our customers is a doubling of site inspections, both time spent out there and physical inspections recorded. And then on the right-hand side, just we've had really good retention this year. We've had four changes in position across our team, and that really signals a move into operational. So the year before we had 15 new appointments, and that was really building after our restructure and our split from consent processing. Yeah, and that, everything.
Can you go back one slide, please? Sorry. Your long-term trends, they are increasing, Jay. They're not diminishing. So what are we doing wrong, or what aren't we doing? Because that's a big jump from, I don't know what year that is, but look, you got to 830 in June.
Yeah. So
that's a hike.
Is a positive increasing trend.
Right.
So that's the number of sites that we're getting across. Okay. So we're able to monitor more every year. Yeah.
Your language is not right then.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Kumutu koe.
Can I just make a comment? Many of this committee will remember that a few years ago, the committee identified that you didn't think that we were able to keep monitoring as many of our consented operators as you thought would be appropriate. And so the committee went through and recommended that additional staff be put into this part of the business. And so I think one of the important things that Jack's been trying to articulate is the success that has come from the additional resourcing that you've put forward, because I know that as councillors, you'll be putting ratepayers' money into additional resources, although a large amount of this is actually cost recovered. But it's important that we show you that we've been using those resources efficiently to get good outcomes. So I think that's one of the big purposes of Jack's presentation.
Warren, we're closing, or you want a question?
Oh, thanks for the ability to ask questions, Katarina. Just that right-hand diagram, really quickly, Jack, it just seems that you do a lot of work in June and bugger all in July.
Yes.
Am I reading it wrong or something?
No, that'd be a good summary. So July tends to be our planning year. So we report everything up until 30th of June. So July is really when we're looking at the effort that we've got and the work that we've got on. That's not to say we're doing nothing. These are sites that are completed. So we're probably not going to do anything more on them for that year, but our officers will be looking at a number of sites and monthly data returns coming in, going out and doing site visits. So that is not reflected of the work done. It's just the tracking of how many sites have been
Over the year.
Okay. Yeah, and it's cumulative. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
No,
it's a really good observation, Warren, and
it.
it's something that our consenting teams are looking at as well. Historically, when consents have been issued, there's been obligations around reporting, and reporting often coming in around May, June time. And so you can't do your final compliance assessment until May, June time. And so there would be a whole bunch of work through the course of the year. But when you hit the button to say, I've done the final compliance assessment, it's at that time, which does create a little bit of workload pressure at that time of the year. And so the consenting teams are looking, well, how might we phase those things differently so that everybody isn't having their annual reports in that time of the year? And equally for our customers who have, how might it better help them be able to phase over the course of the year their reporting so that they're not having this end of year rush, because everybody has an end of year rush. And so those are things that are being identified by the team, and of course consents are in place. You just progressively change that over time, but for now we've still got that end of year rush. Yeah.
Just checking we're not giving you too much budget, that's all.
Of course, as you know, this is the work that Jack's team do is for 80% recovered from consent holders.
Ka pai tēnā. Kumutu. Kia ora, Jack.
Thank you, everybody.
Do we have to remove that report? So can I have someone move the report? Robbie? Yep, and second, ka pai. Who's next? Anna Marie. Morena, Anna Marie. No mai hara mai ki te tepu o PCE. It's all yours.
Anna Maria Dobea toko ingawa. I'm trusting that you found the previous presentation very informative and that you got a really clear indication of what the two monitoring teams are busy at and the last year's results. So this report, as you know, I report regularly to the Environmental Performance Committee on regional consent activities, the consenting side of the business. This one is a summary of the last year. I don't have a presentation, so I'm just going to talk to a couple of items and then happy to answer any questions. So I think I'm confident that we did a pretty good job last year. We processed 809 applications and there were some that were out of statutory timeframes where we had to apply discount regulations, but we were still well within our annual plan target of, which is set at 95% of all applications should be processed in statutory timeframes, and we were at 98%. So those 25 applications that were out of timeframe influenced that result. Just moving on to the other features of the report, we've got a table there that sets out all the applications that are currently notified and in process. You'll probably recognise some of these because they've been in previous reports. You'll appreciate that some of these notification processes take some time to work their way through. We then have the second table, which is around those applications that are subject to appeal or other objection type processes. So we've got a new one in there, a marine farm extension, Bartram Trust, that's just come through. I've then got on page 4 a summary of the water consent applications that the team process. We've got some details there around how many remain in the deferral queue. There's 144 still remaining. And we have had some resourcing changes in the last within the team in the last 3 months, which have impacted our ability to keep moving on those. But we should have replacement staff in place in the coming months, so we'll get back into that. Meanwhile, there were 198 water take applications were processed.
198
water take applications lodged with council were processed and determined. That's in the top sentence and clause E. They're across the whole of the Waikato, not just in the Waikato River catchment. The last page is a quick summary of what the types of applications we have in the fast track space. Again, these were probably on the previous reports list. They also will remain there until they're determined and by the Environmental Protection Authority and the panels that they set up for those. So there's the Waiuku Wind Farm. There's some activity going on with that at the moment. And we've just recently had the decision granted to the Rotokawe Greenway here in Hamilton. We do have another fast track application that is on the horizon. So these two were lodged under the COVID Recovery Act, COVID-19 Recovery Act. The replacement for that was a fast track process under the MBEA Act, which has been repealed, but the portion of it that enabled lodgement of fast track applications is still there. And we've got an application due to be lodged with the EPA by NZTA for the Cambridge Pireri section of the expressway in the next month or so. So that'll be something that the team will be looking at. And then just as a heads up, the new fast track bill is we're expecting to get an indication of what that will look like mid to late October. So I think you may have heard before that part of the legislation when these provisions in the past have been created by government, they usually list a number of projects. So we're expecting to see a list and identify those that might be in the Waikato region, but equally the provisions enable people to apply. So we'll obviously get an indication from some of our through our relationships with larger industries, whether they might be considering applying. It is a challenging area to work on for the team because, as you can appreciate, the language fast track, the timeframes that are allocated not just to parties who participate, but obviously the panels that are created and established to look at each of these applications are very short. It can be within requirements to respond to information within 10 working days, for example. And the quantum of information is substantial. You would anticipate for larger scale, typically infrastructure projects, that you would be submitting a lot of information on all the different topics that have to be considered. So that can be pretty challenging to look at such a short timeframes. We also get from these panels minutes, which are sort of instructions or directions for the parties who are participating to do certain things within certain times. So that, you have to. So the challenge for our team is how do we resource that where we've got people busy on what I might call just business as usual work, all the consent work that's coming in, and drop everything as and when we need to pay attention to these activities. That's something that we'll be looking at. So just before I open up for questions, certainly as you're aware, different directorates have business plans, and we set aside goals that we have for the coming year. And one of our goals that we've identified for our section, the regional consent section, is to identify resourcing strategies for specific work streams that are coming at us. One is the fast track space, one is the amendments to the Act. Also focusing, as you might have heard from Jack, specific monitoring strategies to do with industry sectors and things like that. So, and various other things. So I just thought I'd offer that insight while I was here. More than happy to answer any questions.
Any questions, Ben?
Yeah, in terms of the COVID-19 fast track, you've obviously had resourcing issues with that for the wind farm or whatever. How do you think they're going to vary with the new fast track legislation? And how is your staffing going in terms of, because obviously in COVID there was difficulty with retention. How are you looking at now in terms of?
So several questions there. So in terms of the new Act, we haven't had any signals from government or the drafters of the new legislation that the types of steps that they have had in place under COVID-19 fast track system are going to be dramatically different. So we're anticipating a similar framework of what applications will step through and the points when different parties are engaged with, and we are one of those parties. So we haven't had any indication that that's going to be dramatically different. In terms of the team's ability to respond to fast tracks, these two here are quite different. So the Waiuku wind farm, the nature of the resource consents that are sought from the region were principally around earthworks for tracking, maybe some culverting, stream diversions if there was those features within the landscape. Those are pretty easy for the team to respond to. The Rotakari Greenway was definitely, I'd say, the team was challenged, and not just our team, but other divisions of the organisation where we confer with in terms of expertise, scientific input. This one had features, a much wider range of consent sought from the region, including things like diversions, stream discharges, modifications. How was stormwater going to be dealt with in the long term as the whole catchment was eventually developed, channeled through this particular area? The science around that is much more involved, and the time frame in which we had to evaluate the information was pretty challenging. So that's so it depends on the nature of the applications that are sought for the particular proposal that comes at us. I don't have the magic answer yet of how we're going to cope with these, but we've definitely got it in our strategy that we need to be thinking differently about how we resource those when they do come.
And just staff retention compared with COVID, yeah.
Staff retention through COVID. That was performer.
I'll grab that because Anna Maria wasn't here then. It's looking pretty good. I think we've probably got maybe 1 or 2 vacancies in the in the consenting side of the section, so it's looking good. If I can just add to one of the answers that Anna Marie was giving around fast track, as you would expect, when we process applications, we don't retain expertise on council for every single different matter. So we'll go out and we'll obtain that expertise because that's the most cost-effective way of doing so. Some of that expertise sits within our science teams, but they're very busy doing work as well for the organisation. And so when something comes in that requires a response from this council and requires us to get advice, sometimes there's just not physically the time to engage somebody, let alone get them to review things, to provide advice. That's a real challenge because often through traditional consenting processes, a lot of that information comes from the regional council. And so when it comes time to submitting on things like fast track bills, we'll be promoting to council submissions to enable council within a fast process to do the things that the community expects of this council. So you can expect that to happen. Additionally, we're working with our colleagues at Hamilton City because they're equally expecting to be hammered with fast track applications. And so talking with Hamilton City about how can we work together when there's a proposal that comes through for fast track, which is hammering both councils under their obligations as a consent authority and our own, because the Rota Kauri one was a little bit different in that the proponent of that was a joint venture between Hamilton City and a developer. And so they did a lot of work up front because that's a really important project for Hamilton City. It's not necessarily that all fast track proposals will have that level of work up front, which does put pressure on the consent authorities to represent the community by making sure there's the right information there for these independent commissioners who then make decisions that then come back to the two councils to implement. So there's some challenges in that space. And while I've got the mic, I'd just make an apology. There was one line that was in the wrong table. The Thames Coromandel wastewater operation at Matarangi, it's shown under the appeals table. It should be under the applications that are subject to hearing. That application was heard and the commissioners have adjourned whilst they are seeking more information. If it's something that you would like to have any more information about, Warren, given that it's in your constituency, happy to give you a briefing afterwards, but that one hearing's being closed while the commissioners are seeking further information.
Thanks, Brent. And if I may, Madam Chair, just my impression was that the TCDC also had a consent application for repairs to the seawall along Buffalo Beach. Are you aware of anything there, or is that sitting with us? What, Anna Marie? Sorry.
So the in the table on page 4 at the top, Buffalo Beach Homeowners Association.
I know the TCDC one where there's an area they call the shark bite that was washed out in Gabrielle, and I've been led to believe that it's been held up by us, but that may not be correct.
I'll have to inquire into the team.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah. It's repairs to the existing seawall where it was taken out in the storm.
There's one on here, but it says reconsenting seawall protecting private property. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, that's
it's not a
spot. Yeah.
Okay. We'll look at that one. Okay. Any more? Kumutu? Kapatina. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Yeah, Ben and Robbie. Our next one is on page 28, and it is Tracy. Tracy? No, my Tracy. She's a temporary PC.
In the spirit of we're a little bit behind in timing, I'm just wondering if we're able to take the report as read, and then Tracy can just you've got a really pretty short presentation, isn't it, Trace?
Okay, so if you've got some issuing points that you need to talk to, or if you want the table to open up the questions, and because we're taking it as read,
Yeah.
I'm happy to do either way.
It's a pretty short presentation. It's just we'll just go through it quickly to catch up.
I'll go through it quite quickly.
Okay.
Next slide, please. So as you know, this is just an update on implementation activities for Freshwater Farm Plan and PC1. Next slide, please. So as you will know, PC1 is still in the Environment Court and they are still deliberating. Recent minutes are highlighting areas of the plan which the court are grappling with, which is, around the use of overseer as a rule gateway, policy direction, accommodating tangata whenua, ancestral land within the framework, and the interaction with the National Freshwater Farm Plan regs. So the court has signalled that it's likely going to need an S293 process to bring the appellants back together to discuss things which weren't discussed before, which will likely mean a delay in decision making. So just wanted to bring that up with you. And then where freshwater farm plans are at, as you know, the government has asked us to take a light touch while they look to make improvements. And the minister has signalled his intention to look at what pause means. So we are waiting to hear. So next slide, please. MFE and MPI are talking to lots of people to understand how the system could be improved, and part of the regional sector reference group, we have staff who are involved in that, which I think is great. I won't go into it. Next slide, please. And next slide. Oh, can you go back? Did I miss a slide? Oh, there is a slide missing. All right, so I will just talk to it then. So look, what the regional sector reference group, the key points that have gone to MFE are, we think certification and the audit process is really important for the system. We support and the recognition of some existing industry plans, and we think that data requirements are really important. So what I know from Hamish Smith is that this information's gone to MFE. They're going to put it together. There will probably be another round of engagement, which will be the regional sector coming together with the industry, which I think is really good because at the moment it's been separate. Next slide. So some of the things that we're doing at the moment to connect with our stakeholders during this time of uncertainty, which I know I'm a bit of a broken record about, is we are working in partnership with Dairy NZ around a PC1 dairy sector workshops. So we're bringing the supply companies together and MPI, and we're going to come up with a PC1 implementation strategy that is just for dairy. So I'm really excited by this approach. We are hoping that it works well and we can learn some lessons so we can roll it out for the hort sector and the dry stock sector. The hort deep dive that I know that some of you are going to come to, look, more information is on its way. This came about because Brent and I were hosted by Hort NZ at the Ana Whenua Trophy. And from that, I was invited to go and talk to the Pukekohe Vegetable Growers Association, and they were excellent. And we talked about how we can better connect and understand the hort sector. And so I have been working with them to get a range of people across the council and councillors to come up to Pukekohe. There'll be a talk in the morning around some of the tools they use to understand nutrients and their code of practice. Then we're going to go out onto 2 farms to understand how vegetables are grown, and there's going to be a number of other growers there, so we've got an opportunity to talk to them and learn from them. So again, I'm really, really excited by this, and I know that they are very pleased in the response of the number of you that are coming and the number of staff that are coming. And then just so you know, every 6 months we do a stakeholder survey just to make sure that what we're doing is adding value, because there's no point in us doing stuff that people don't want. And the initial findings are that people are really happy with our engagement, and they have recognised it as a challenging space, but they're happy with our level of engagement. Questions?
In?
Yeah, just in terms of Waipa, they have to submit their freshwater plans by February 2025. Given MFE's not planning the changes till early 2025 and now PC1 slightly delayed. Are you going to extend that deadline? And secondly, how many have actually submitted their plans to date?
We've had one plan submitted, which was a kiwi fruit orchard, and that's been really good to understand how our system could work to receive a plan. Our understanding is that the current government is looking at ways to pause, which means then that plans would not have to be submitted by February 2025, but we're waiting for the announcement. And Brent looks like he wants to say something.
Yeah, it's absolutely the right question, Ben. And as you would expect, behind the scenes, we are asking on a very regular basis, when are we going to hear something formally that we can share? Because it's really an unacceptable place of uncertainty for those farmers, because currently the law requires them to have a farm plan by February next year. Whilst I shouldn't prejudge what the government and cabinet will do, my strong sense is that in the very near future there will be a decision made to pause, and that decision will then be articulated to people, and then there'll be a legal process for how they go about giving effect to it. But you can be sure that we are advocating strongly for that to happen yesterday and not tomorrow, so that people can then start planning forward. But my strong expectation is that in the not too distant future, a pause will be announced. But I can't announce it because I'm not the minister. But because the alternative is just not acceptable. As you know, 1,500 farmers having to get a farm plan suddenly between now and February is just not really feasible.
What else? No more? Yes, that's Tracy.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Okay. Who's next?
Please have an invite to the.
Tracy, before you leave, can you send the invite for the Hort session through to Robbie?
Right. I thought it went to everybody. Yeah, that's the 22nd of August. Yeah.
Yeah, if you just get that invitation through to Robbie, he might have missed it first time around.
Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Yep. Kia ora kōrua, no mai haere mai ki te tepu. Yep, we'll go.
Kia ora koutou. Hayden Jones tōku ingoa, Madam Chair, councillors. So this piece of work, looking at some erosion and sediment modelling, was led by the catchment processes and mitigation specialist in my team, Tim Norris. Tim's currently away on leave, so myself and Mike will be presenting this work today. The modelling was undertaken by Manaaki Whenua, Landcare Research, particularly Simon Vale and Hugh Smith. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this work was funded by the Regional Resilience Team and ICM. Next slide, please. So soil erosion and the sediment that results from that does continue to be an issue for our region. SOE reporting indicates that around 46% of water quality sites are below national bottom line in terms of visual clarity. And the New Zealand Land Resource Inventory indicates that more than 1 million hectares of land in the region is affected by erosion to some degree, and about 210,000 hectares of pastoral land is classified as having severe to extreme erosion potential, which is indicated by the map on the right there. WRC has been actively addressing soil erosion through extensive soil conservation and initiatives and riparian works, and has invested around $55 million in current terms over the years in soil conservation, with other investment from others, such as landowners and other co-funders. This erosion and sediment modelling was undertaken using SEDIMENT NZ. This is a process-based model that has been calibrated for specifically for New Zealand conditions. And this modelling had 5 objectives. Firstly, to set a contemporary baseline in terms of sediment and erosion. Secondly, to look at the impact of past mitigation activities. Thirdly, to model the effectiveness of future mitigation scenarios. Fourthly, to model the impact of climate change scenarios on long-term erosion and sediment loads. And fifthly, to assess load reductions required to meet national bottom lines under the MPSFM. Next slide, please. So straight to the results. We're talking about looking at the current baseline. The map on the left shows sediment yields in tonnes of sediment per kilometre squared per year. The orange to red colours indicate the higher yields, more erosion. So you can see that much of the West Coast catchment management zone and southern parts of Waipa in particular have higher sediment yields. And the graph on the right there shows sediment loads in kilotons of sediment per year. And clearly the West Coast zone has by far and away the highest loads at a little over 800 kilotons per year. And next would be Waipa and Upper Waikato at a little over 300 kilotons per year. And the reason for those high yields from the West Coast, it's relating to a predominance of steep hill country and also soft underlying geology, soft rock geology. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of looking at the effectiveness of past mitigations to date, the modelling considered retrospective scenarios to look at this, and it also took into account sort of broader scale land use changes that have occurred. It assessed the erosion or sediment loads at 4 points in time that relate to the 4 time steps of the land cover database. And what the modelling showed was that these mitigation efforts across the region over the modelling period from 2002 through to 2017 resulted in a 4% decrease in sediment loads. Next slide, please. So this modelling also considered what the effectiveness of future modelling scenarios might be. So how it did this is it looked at a range of scenarios that considered treatment on some of the most erosion-prone land, so land use capability classes 6E, which would be treated using space planting, and classes 7E and 8E, which would be treated by afforestation with Indigenous species. And essentially the scenarios considered different levels or different proportions of that most erodible land being treated. So namely 20%, that's known as the M20 scenario, 30%, 40%, 50%, right through to the most ambitious scenario being 100% of that most erodible land being treated. Results indicate that under the most ambitious scenario, the M100, 41%, there would be a 41% reduction in sediment load across the region, whereas under the M20 scenario, the 20% of that most erodible land being treated, that would result in a 13% reduction in sediment load. Next slide, please. So in summary, in terms of contemporary baseline erosion or sediment load, modelling indicated that across the region, it's 2,000 or about 2,300 kilotons of sediment produced per year, ending up at the coast. Region-wide sediment loads will be decreased by 4%, or were decreased by 4% between 2002 and 2017 in response to soil conservation and riparian management activities to date. It also indicated that future mitigation scenarios could decrease sediment loads by up to 41%. To meet national bottom lines, modelling shows that load reductions would be required at 56% of our water quality monitoring sites. Also shows that climate change is expected to increase or exacerbate erosion and increase sediment loads. A number of different climate change scenarios were considered, looking at or based on different representative greenhouse gas concentration pathways. If we consider the most conservative of those pathways, then modelling indicates that would be looking at an increase of 12 to 24% in sediment loads by 2040. And those proportions will be much higher for so some of the other more extreme climate change or concentration pathways. And based on these results, staff in ICM and in my team are working together in terms of how to use this information to inform catchment management priorities and programs going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So what is WRC's input into erosions in private lands? For instance, the majority of erosions that happen on farmlands in the hill country. What's our responsibility as WRC to those erosions, or because they belong in private farms? Anyone, Mike?
So our staff and
Do we have a relationship? Is it a responsibility of ours?
Our staff and ICM do work together with landowners in terms of implementing soil conservation works and riparian activities. And perhaps Grant Blackie from ICM.
I know. Grant, welcome. I know what Waipa does. I've been around there, but I just wanted to see whether we do these riparian plantings and that because we see and know the erosion, or do we do it because the farmer has asked us to help? And what's our input into that?
Morning, members of the committee. Yeah, Grant Blackie. So I'm the manager for the Waikato West Coast Catchment Management Section. What's our responsibility, I think was the first question. Regional plan sets out statutory and non-statutory approaches to dealing with a bunch of issues.
Okay.
And one of the non-statutory approaches is to incentivize work to help farmers and others reduce soil erosion and give advice and other things we might do. So it is set out in our policies as something we do. We've been doing it for quite a few years. You go back to, the Soil Conservation Rivers Control Act in 1941, which set out the basis for our responsibilities in terms of land use and soil erosion. But the second question, I think, was around priorities and how do we decide, does someone ring up and ask us or whatever? We have a regional prioritisation framework based on modelling, based on several layers of modelling, which SEDIMENT was one of them, which prioritises the catchments in which we are required to spend 80% of our funding right around the region. And so we have maps showing, parts of the Waipa, parts of the West Coast, parts of all of the zones where we target the worst areas for erosion. The updated SEDIMENT information will be used to update the regional prioritisation framework so we can focus our efforts more and refine, where we're spending our money, essentially to treat the worst erosion sites. So it's not a case of a landowner ringing up. Landowner ring up and say, we've got a problem, and depending on where they are, our response might be, we can come and visit, we can give some advice, we can provide poplar poles, can't actually help you out with much in the way of cash or a plan because they're in the wrong area. Yeah, but 20% of our funding is available outside of the priority areas as well.
Okay. Kia ora, kia ora. Did you want to say something, Mike, before Bruce asks a question?
I just wanted to add, and linking to what Tracy was talking about around farm plans. So PC1 requires farmers to have those farm plans and focus action in those plans on particular issues relevant to their catchment. So there's also that policy driver through PC1 to have farmers addressing sediment loss in those parts of the region where we have high sediment concentrations.
Bruce.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions. I've got, a couple of questions. And thanks for the information. And one of the questions relates to the map, that fantastic map that you put up across the region, because that's extremely broad scale. And I was interested in first of all, whether or not that map is different or similar or whatever to the Parliamentary Commissioner's map that he put up at his recent presentation. Has your map informed his or vice versa? And what is the resolution of that map where you can give reliable predictions? At what scale? At what scale? Because the map was 1 to 1 million or more, was it? Yeah, it's fairly broad scale.
Yeah, certainly a regional scale map there, showing the outputs for the region as a whole. In terms of the first part of the question, we haven't directly compared this map to what the Parliamentary Commissioner was showing. I'm not 100% sure what they were showing there, but I don't believe that was informed by this individual piece of modelling.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the scale, so one of the advantages of SEDIMENT NZ is that it is scalable in a sense. The loads and yields are calculated down to sort of catchment level, and so we can look down at a finer resolution and be confident in the estimates that the model is giving in the context that it is modelling. But it can be viewed at finer scales, not just the broad regional scale.
And then the second one really was just an observation traveling through the country. So I regularly drive the Awakino Gorge. And at the moment, there's been significant clearance of forest along the crest of the very, the frontage that is directly beside the road on slopes that, by my estimate by eye, would be greater than 40 degrees. And I'm just wondering where does that sort of scenario fit in all of this? Because it struck me that, first of all, the timing of the clearance, it looked like it had been cleared during winter or close to winter. So there's a fair bit of stuff coming down the hillside, I'm sure. And yeah, is this simply a permitted activity that because it was forestry that they're allowed to then go in and clear? Because, I mean, just for the casual observer, it just didn't look good to me.
Somebody to turn on. Probably easiest if I grab that one. So there is a national environmental standard. It used to be called National Environmental Standard Plantation Forestry. It's now called National Environmental Standard CF, whatever that means now. But it's so the National Environmental Standard makes it a permitted activity, subject to certain requirements. And that involves providing notice, providing a harvest plan, all those sorts of things, and that we administer those. And then we, similar to what Jack was mentioning before, we have a prioritisation process around which ones we will be able to spread our resources to inspect. And that's based on a range of different factors, including things such as slope and the environmental risk. So if there's a particular site that you have an interest in, Bruce, I can connect you up with folk to know a little bit more about the actual ongoing monitoring, because sometimes things can look not good, but then when you get into the detail of the monitoring, that actually there hasn't been any issues in terms of the practical loss of sediment. But yeah, there is a national environmental standard came in a number of years ago that permits these things, subject to some compliance around harvest plans and timing and what have you.
Yeah, so I mean, just a bit more detail, because it basically at the very crest, at the highest point on that range, and below it is native forest. And the question then also becomes, what will happen now that it has been taken off? What's the plan to prevent ongoing sedimentation? Is it just going to be put back in another crop of trees that are going to be pulled out again and cause a further pulse directly into the Awakino River? I must say, it's right above the river. Or would there be a requirement to put it back into native?
So we can have that conversation offline, but Grant probably knows more about the National Environmental Standard for Forestry than many of us, having looked after that area for such a long time. But there certainly aren't obligations for parties to put it back into native. But Grant, you could probably explain it better.
Yeah, just briefly. So if the trees were planted before 1990, you can't convert it into grass without a resource consent because of the carbon issues. There's no obligation on the landowner to plant anything other than pine trees in there. They could plant native if they choose to, but that would be pretty unlikely given the costs, depending on the areas and so forth. But yeah, there's no specific obligation on the landowner to plant anything other than pine trees or other species they choose to. But not grass. Yeah.
Sure, Grant. Warren.
Thank you. Just following up from Katarina's question, I know we have a contestable fund for hill country erosion work in that. I'm just wondering on the uptake on that. Does anyone have an idea?
I might get Kerry to answer that, given she's a bit closely more involved with that project.
Just answer the question, Kerry. I don't need a.
Yep. So uptake has been very good. It was a little slow because we were late in getting confirmation from MPI last year about our funding, but for particularly the West Coast, we're already fully allocated for the next 12 months.
Yeah.
And most of the other zones are well on the way as well. We expect that we will have more interest than we have funding.
Thank you.
Thank you. Robbie?
you. Is there any numbers or what has actually been the erosion that's coming off the dock reserve? Because you look at it in the Waihau catchment, I think a third of the catchment is actually dock reserve or dock controlled land. So what is the mitigating factor of how much are they actually tonnes per square kilometre is actually coming out of the dock area itself, not actually off productive farmland? So is that number, or even forestry, or you put the whole lot in there? If you actually go to the back to the map, you can see the line that in the Waihau Piaka area, what it's actually causing the effect, and it's actually most of it won't actually be farmland at all. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. Is that number actually being assessed of what is actually coming off non-productive land?
So the results haven't been expressed in terms of land ownership groupings. But yeah, certainly steeper land in a lot of places will tend to have a higher erosion potential, depending on land cover, of course. But so you could generally expect that a lot of dock estate tends to be on steeper country, and so yeah, that land would tend to have higher erosion potential, but under a continuous tree cover of closed canopy, that certainly mitigates impacts of rainfall on generating landslides and so forth. But yeah, this work hasn't separated out the results in that way.
Yeah, but like for the Waihau, it's a third of the catchment. I think it is the number. What I remember of when the scheme was designed, they designed that 1/3 of the area wasn't going to be roadable. So it is a significant area that is like, we're meaning as hill country, no matter where it is, it's going to slip and slide. Yet I hope we're not going to see that those rules, the total amount coming down the system isn't calculated to where it's actually coming from is really important, because otherwise it puts a biased view to it. That's all. Thank you.
Makes sense. Something to look at, I guess. So just off the cuff, this erosion in here is mainly inland. It's nothing to do with coastal erosion. Okay.
No, it's inland. Yeah,
inland.
It's not coastal erosion.
Yeah. So is there anywhere where coastal erosion is inclusive in EPC at all? Brent?
Absolutely. If it's a topic that future committees would like to have a paper around, we've got a pretty significant coastal team working in Mike's area that can come and present around what's. In fact, there's an overlap again with our ICM colleagues, so it's really great that our science and ICM team are here to present on this topic to you guys together. So we can do that if it's something that's of interest to the committee. Yeah,
well, it's just that a couple of weeks ago we went to Moko. And then with what's happening in the port, all of the erosion there and the housing stuff, and I just wondered where we were, because when we got called up there, two things was happening. It was the people were taken to court. That was one of it, and the other one was the community just complaining to WRC and my tomo about the erosion of the sea and the seawalls. That was all. Just wanted to know where does that come into WRC for us to be over it or understanding it or something?
So just to build on what Brent said, we have long-term shoreline profile monitoring network, and if EPC would like a report on that, we could bring that.
We'll look at it. If ICM is working on it, there has to be a componentry that I think might overlap within this committee, not all of it. Okay, Kapai? Ben?
Madam Chair. Item 11 here says that to meet the NPS for freshwater management by 2020, 56% of the sites need load reductions to achieve the national bottom line. What is the time frame for that?
That would be based on the the calculated current baseline as at 2017, I think, in terms of the modelling.
Me to add, so the timeframe to meet the target would be set in our regional plan review by the community. So they might, as we did with PC1, we set an 80-year target to achieve the long-term targets, the long-term changes. So similarly here, the load reductions required to achieve that national bottom line could be set over short, medium or long term, depending on what the community sees as the most appropriate, given the obviously the costs. Many of you will be aware of work that Beef and Lamb have recently done, sort of looking at the potential impacts of these sediment bottom lines and the NPSFM on sheep and beef farms. And so there is that question of achieving these reductions is going to be very difficult and very costly. And so the community has to determine, first of all, where they need to set the targets and how long they allow for meeting those.
It's just when we were going through the freshwater management strategy last year, a lot of the community were having very short time frames, 2034, 2035, and wanting 100% meeting the targets by that stage. So just if you look at your item 40, under the M100 erosion, which is 100% of sites get treated, you still get down to 25% aren't dealt with. So what is the cost implications of this? If we're spending 55 million in the last decade, what are we looking at to even get to 27% of sites at M100? What does it cost to get to M100?
I don't know, Hayden, if there was the modelling that was done didn't go into the dollars, but I mean, you know full well it's going to be hundreds of millions, billions to achieve those sorts of reductions.
Well, this is the thing I keep pointing out is we never look at what the economic impacts are, and I wish we did the modelling and added in the costs as well, so the community can have a fair balance of consideration. I mean, is it possible to get the economic impacts?
Just through the chair, I can probably just quickly answer that. We have, so not with this particular modelling, we haven't done it yet, but with the previous iteration, the regional prioritisation framework, we also applied mitigations to those areas and costed them and then looked at the load reductions. And so that's in the Waikato Waipā River Restoration Strategy. I don't think, to my knowledge, it's been done for Hauraki, but we were talking, so the restoration strategy looks at $330 million for the Waikato Waipā River catchment to address the biggest issues. So that was an indication back in 2018.
Well, as this moves forward, could we put the economic side in as well?
So I think there's a couple of elements here, Councillor. The science team are doing what we ask of them, which is to provide us the information. And then it becomes for our implementation arm and ICM and our policy team to use that information and add the things that you've talked about, so that they can then have an informed council decision on what to do. So the economic information that you're talking about is absolutely relevant. It's just not the reporting of the science of what we're finding, if that makes sense. It's the next step, because if the science had found that there was not much to do, then there wouldn't need to be a following conversation. So this is a step in that process, and the first, if you like, step is the science team have identified there's a bit to do.
Yeah, it makes sense, I guess. But in saying that, I understand your question. What I guess our team needs to be aware of is that we don't want the economic to stop the work they're doing. In theory, because without having the reports back that's happening with on the lands, if we look at what's happening there and marry it up to dollars, you will most probably find we can't afford to do it. You know, so what then? So then we move it over to ICM and say, well, this is what we found, ICM, you go and find the money to fix it. So it's a dilemma in itself, but it's understandable that we need to understand that for the community's sake. But remember, the community in all of our EPC is mostly, in this particular one, is on the farmlands, more than in the community itself.
Madam Chair, but it's just when they have these reports, if you know it's 330 million for Waikato Waipa, I'd just like that to be included when we have got that data already. Because otherwise
Yeah,
the
we have
NPS is saying in 80 years' time, we have to get this done, or maybe it's 30 years' time. It's because each, I mean, some of the, we're setting it within 10 or 20 years rather than 80. So it's just to be realistic. Otherwise, you're not able to meet your
We'll
legislative.
leave it to Brent. If it's easy enough for you to put some dollar figures in some areas, then it'd be good if you can. If not, we'll work on a scenario around how that can be done somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Hear the question, Ben, and absolutely to ensure that there is a pathway for that to come into to the councillors, whatever that is, whichever is the right pathway, whether or not that's through the science team or reporting through, like I say, through the policy committee or through to ICM. So absolutely, I think everybody in the room is hearing the question to make sure that information gets through to you.
Okay. Kapai, kumuti koe? Kia ora, kumuti ni.
Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. So can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Yep. I'll do it. I'm happy to do that. Next page is page 41, which is our acid sulfate soils. Kia ora, Jonathan. Koe?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Yes, if I could just have my, oh, sorry, you're getting my slides up, thanks. So this morning I'm presenting on an acid sulfate soil map that we've just had developed for the Waikato region. This map allows us to identify where these acid sulfate soils are likely to be and how we can manage the risk that those acid sulfate soils pose. If I could just move to the next slide, please. So previously I have reported to this committee back in 2020 and 2021 on the findings of a series of fish kill events that were occurring over a decade that we'd have been observing. And these events were occurring in the Aka Ota drainage area, and we subsequently identified that those fish kill events were linked to acidic discharges from acid sulfate soils that were present in that location. So acid sulfate soils are naturally occurring soils, sediments and peats that contain iron sulfides that have been formed during historic inundation of land that is close to coastal areas. They can also be found, however, well inland as well. And they typically don't pose a risk when they're in their natural waterlogged state. It's when those soils are drained or excavated, water table drops significantly during extended drought periods that they become exposed to the air and can become oxidized and can produce acidic conditions. Next slide, please. So the issue is obviously the acidity can cause environmental impacts on aquatic organisms, but also that acidity can also mobilize naturally occurring metals such as copper, aluminium, zinc, arsenic. It can also mobilize nutrients like phosphates, nitrates, ammonium ions, and so their mobility and transport into groundwater is accelerated. From there, they can also get into nearby waterways. So they'll have harmful effects on aquatic organisms within those waterways. They can also contaminate drinking water, especially if you're taking your drinking water from groundwater sources. The other big issue is that if you've got any buried underground infrastructure in acid sulfate soil areas, they can experience accelerated deterioration or corrosion, such as the concrete or pipework systems. Next slide, please. So where are they found? It's a well-recognised issue around the world, including Australia and the UK, where they have very well developed policy and regulation to manage the risks from acid sulfate soils. They're also found in places like the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland. And their presence in the northern parts of New Zealand has been known since the 70s, but it's only more widely been recognised and investigated as part of some big infrastructure projects. You may have heard in 2014 there was the failed Marsden City development in Ruakaka up in Northland, where subdivision was being prepared, had all the stormwater network put in place, and then they realised that it was deteriorating due to corrosion from acid sulfate soils that hadn't been investigated. They hadn't realised that the acid sulfate soils were there, and that whole project fell over. There was also the Puhoi to Wellsford motorway development, where there was some extensive investigation of acid sulfate soils for that planned route because it went through areas where it was known that acid sulfate soils were. And more recently in 2016, Auckland Council has had a regional map developed by GHD, which predicts areas of high to low risk of acid sulfate soils. Next slide, please. So in 2022, we engaged GHD to develop a similar acid sulfate soil probability of occurrence map for the Waikato region. The inputs for that map include geological data from GNS's QMap, a lot of data on soil type, soil classification, soil texture and order. Elevation data is also an important risk factor for acid sulfate soils, wetland layer and land cover data as well, all used to inform acid sulfate soil probability of occurrence. So the outputs of the map include 4 classifications, either negligible risk, low, moderate and high risk. And that map has been refined further using ground truthing. So we've had 100 at 100 locations across the region, samples collected up to a depth of 2 metres. Those samples were sent off to Australia for analysis using a suite that identifies acid sulfate soils. And from that, the information has been used to further refine the resolution and the accuracy of that map. We're also looking at using the LIDAR data set, which has now become available for the region, which wasn't available when we were first getting the map done. That will help further refine the accuracy of the map. Next slide, please. So we have on the right-hand side here, we have the map, which is a spatial layer, which is able to be put into our mapping system. The pink areas identify those high probability areas. The green are the negligible, yellow and orange are the low and moderate level risk areas. So you can see that the high probability areas are those low-lying areas in Haraki and Waikato. And as part of this project, we also had a report provided by GHD, which provides a discussion of the methodology they used, the results of the mapping outputs, and also the results of the ground truthing soil sampling exercise. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do with the map? We've already had the map and associated report peer reviewed by Manaki Whenua Landcare Research. They came up with some really good recommendations on how that map could be further refined and improved. So as part of that exercise, we had the map further refined. There are further refinements that could be undertaken, but we're just looking at that as budget allows. And currently the report has been prepared for publication as the Waikato Regional Council Technical Reports, which will be published on our website, as well as making the spatial layer accessible in our own mapping system and the publicly accessible Waikato maps. And the intention is that it will inform development of regional guidance for development and infrastructure projects, so those large excavation projects. It will also support our ICM team to around maintenance of the pump station, floodgate and drainage systems. We've already had some of the acid sulfate soil investigations and information that's helped us with this process have come through upgrades of some of the pump stations already. The Mangawhero and the Churchill pump stations involved acid sulfate soil investigations and management of the risks those acid sulfates posed during those upgrades. And it is intended that in future we'll develop policy and regulation for minimising both the environmental impacts during earthworks projects and also harm to infrastructure. Next slide, please. So some of the activities that pose the greatest risk are any sort of disturbances where you're excavating potential acid sulfate soils to a depth of greater than 0.5 metre, especially where you're excavating large volumes of soil and excavating in close proximity to waterways. Indirect disturbance is also a risk as well, where you're intercepting groundwater or dewatering and changing the groundwater tables, because that can expose those soils to the air, where they can then become oxidised and lead to that acid release. Maintenance of drainage channels is also important, where you have accumulation of sulfates in the sediments, which under reducing conditions will form sulfides again. If they are disturbed later during maintenance, they will then oxidise again and release acid. Also, floodgate and pump station operation and maintenance can have an impact if you're not flushing out that held back water, where you're accumulating acidity and contaminants. So more regular flushing out of those drainage systems will help alleviate some of those issues. Next slide, please. So there are a range of management options that can be undertaken to help reduce the risk from acid sulfate soils. So when you have stockpiled soils, they can be neutralised using lime or calcium carbonate. If you've intercepted groundwater and you've dewatered that groundwater and need to release it again, you can also treat the groundwater as well. Reducing the depth of excavations is important where you can, especially where you're digging drainage channels. If you can try and dig your drainage channels shallower and wider rather than deeper and narrower, you reduce that risk of exposing the underlying deeper soils where the potential risk of acidity is higher. And also when you're looking at infrastructure under the ground, there are specific formulations for concrete, for example, that are resistant to acid sulfate soil attacks. So knowing that acid sulfate soils are there are important when you're looking at preparing and developing your infrastructure. Next slide, please. So an example of where the acid sulfate soil map has already been used is by our water quality scientist, Dean Sandwell. He's been looking at overlaying the high risk areas with the regional state of environment water quality monitoring sites. And he's focused on the Awaroa River monitoring site, which is in that Aka area where we originally identified issues with fish kill events. And he's looking at extending the monitoring to include a suite of contaminants that are associated or indicators of acid sulfate soil effects. Some of those are going to be monitored on a continuous basis rather than just monthly grab samples. And that data can then be logged and telemetered to an online dashboard where you'll get email alerts, etc. So you get that real-time information of when water quality is turning a bit pear-shaped because of effects from acid sulfate soils. And the intention is this will inform our understanding of how acid sulfate soils are impacting water quality in those high-risk areas, and potentially looking at rolling out that additional monitoring to some of these high-risk sites. Next slide, please. So in summary, the series of fish kill events that have occurred in that Aka Ota drainage area had triggered us to investigate further, and we identified that it was acid sulfate soils that were causing those events. It triggered us to have a map developed for our region so we can get an idea of where those high risk areas are, mainly in the Waikato and Haraki basins. And we'll use that map, we'll allow that map to be made available on the Waikato Regional Council webpage, including access to the mapping layer. And the intention is that the map will inform more specific and more proactive policy and plan rules and guidance for avoiding or minimising harm to the environment and infrastructure resulting from the presence and disturbance of those acid sulfate soils. Thank you.
Questions? Ben?
Yeah, thank you. Could we go back 2 slides? Yeah, just wanted to say thank you to actually have some solutions, because because sometimes we don't necessarily see those when we get these
Yep.
reports. But the question I had is, does this mean that you don't want people to clear the drainage ditches, given that that's
Yeah.
when it releases? I mean, should they do it when it's in drought or not in drought, or what?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There are ways you'd want to manage that. So one of the things is if you are excavating them, one of the challenges would be if you're just excavating and putting the sediments to the side of the drain where they will oxidize and then drain back. That oxidized acidity will drain back into this. So it may be that when you do dredge those drains in those high risk areas, you may want to put them in a bury them or put them in an area where they're not going to become oxidized, or you may have to neutralize them. You would need to look at what parts of the season you're doing that drainage. So there are ways to work around it. There's a lot of guidance that Australia has developed around management catchments and drainage systems. So there is a lot of guidance that we can tap into for that sort of thing.
And other question probably for Brent is, are our own contractors now doing this, following these methods? Is it part of your training regime?
So it's a really good question, and I see Greg's in the room because you know that we don't engage those people, but Greg's team does. But I know that Greg's team is in close contact with our science team around the emergency information, which is again a great thing that ICM team are here, because our science team identifies issues that then our implementation arms, both in terms of the work that Greg does, but in terms of the guidance that we can provide to earthworks providers, which will be then best practice guidance as opposed to regulatory obligation. And of course, then in the policy pathway is around, well, how do we turn this information that's coming through into a policy pathway, which would have people be required to do things in a different way. So good question. Maybe I'm not sure if Greg's able to answer now whether or not the techniques that are coming through about guidance is there yet for the people that do work for us. But Jonathan, you mentioned that we're working on guidance.
So yeah, one thing first of all with ICM, I'm having doing a presentation to the team in a couple of weeks' time, just to basically reiterate what I've been you about with the map and some of these ideas of how you can manage in these high risk areas. Quite a lot of ICM staff have been quite familiar with the issue already with regard to some of the pump station upgrades. So there's been station upgrades where they have looked at acid sulfate soils as part of the geotech investigations. With regards compliance monitoring and RUD and earthworks. Obviously, Brian Richmond has got a very good handle for this issue and has been trying to promote it with in earthworks projects. So I have already sort of developed a sort of draft internal sort of guidance, which some staff I think have been making use of. Consultants are becoming a lot more aware of the issue too, and there's already a consented project at Whirianga, the solar farm, where as part of that, the consultants actually identified acid sulfate soils, and so there's an acid sulfate soil management plan put in place so that when they excavate trenches for putting in cabling for the solar panel systems, all that will be well managed. So acid runoff will be managed. There'll be neutralisation used if needed. More and more, some of these earthworks developments, people are becoming more aware of it, but it's still, as I said, we don't sort of have rule in place currently. I'm not aware of any other regional councils who developed regional plans. Northland Regional Council looked at it in their plan review in 2018. But then didn't go ahead with introducing plan rules. Whangarei District Council has got a policy around it. And so there's quite a lot of awareness by developers area around issues.
Thanks, Jonathan. Before I go to you, Robbie, Greg, did you want to add
Yeah,
something?
so thank you, Madam Chair, Morena councillors. So yes, this report's been received by ICM, and as I said, there's a range of applications for it. Particularly, we discussed it at our capital program board meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we're making sure that it's taken into account so that when we identify and scope out our projects, we identify the needs and recommendations from this report so that those projects can be well scoped before we move forward with them.
Robbie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions. How long is when you dig material out of the drain, how long is it soluble to cause that for? Is it
How long before it becomes an issue?
Yeah, is it short term or is it long term?
It's like a few days, and it starts to become a problem. That said, that they've done for this for the Younger solar panel farm project, they have done some trials on those soils to get a feel for it, and they felt that it was perhaps up to a week when things started to show signs of acidity. But some of the Australian guidance indicates 48 hours is probably where you start to have a risk once you've got those stockpiled soils at the surface.
How long does it go for?
Well, it could go for weeks or months, or it could be depending on the amount of soil and the acidity, because different acid sulfate soils can have low acidity or very high acidity. So it could be, a very long-term thing, or it could be, a matter of months or something like that.
Because if I'm just trying to think of it, like most probably when you're doing some cleaning, it's most probably the amount that you're actually pulling out. And well, especially in Akiaka, it wouldn't be so bad because you can just put it on the other side of the stock bank. Most of that's been, so that isn't going to contaminate anything too quickly anyway. So they're most probably a bit safer there than some of the rest of us down the Hauraki Plains, I'd imagine. So when they're cleaning the material out, they can either put it on the other side of the berm that it's actually not going to get directly leached into anything. If it does, it has to go a long way to get somewhere. But yeah, just the cost of to implement that in, say, the Hauraki Plains, and is it any benefit that you're not cleaning every drain every year, so it's not a total catchment contaminant getting in it at any one stage. You're only, say, on a 10-year plan of cleaning the drains. Is it actually as big an issue as it's sounding like when you're only doing compartments as you go? It's not as a total catchment's getting cleaned out at once. That's what I think that's a bit more of our understanding that we need to understand. Is it, I know you're showing there's a contaminant, but is it as big as it's looking if you're doing it in a compartment situation?
Yeah, at this stage, we really don't have a handle on whether it's a big issue or not. We do know that there are localised areas where we have seen issues, but it's early days at this stage.
And the Akiaka one sounded quite easy. If we could actually flush water back into the catchment with fresh water, would resolve quite a bit of that quite easily. So yeah, I think there's a couple of councillors been in that discussion in the last 18 months as well. So yeah, there is ways to fix it. That's for the fish kill issue anyway. Yeah, and I think we've talked about that in the Hauraki Plains of actually letting water back into catchments to dilute the and it brings up one other thing that I've been trying to bring up in council for the last 18 months since we've been here, is I think we've got to get away from land drainage and actually start talking about water management, because that would actually help resolve some of these things. That if we're controlling and managing water, then we're actually letting water in and out of catchments, not just drainage, because drainage is just getting it out of the catchment. So it's just another point.
A lot more conversations. You might have just started in your Ropu.
I've brought it up in mine quite a bit, but yeah.
So these stockpiled soils, are they only stockpiled soils that come out of waterways, or are they
up the ground as well? Yes.
Sorry?
So that not just out of the drains, but also if you've excavated soils from
like how when they build a house, they always take off the topsoil or something, and they stockpile it for months and months before they want to do. Does that affect
by houses? Risk would be
less.
You're normally digging on this perhaps the surface top half meter. Certainly, though, you might be if you did have some quite deep sort of pipe work, that's where you'd probably definitely you like your stormwater pipes and that's where they're quite a bit deeper, more likely to get deterioration.
I know that's good. And when you talk about concrete foundations, does that include the 9 dams up the Waikato River? Can it include the 9 dams up the Waikato River?
It could do. I don't.
Because I know a conversation about a couple of years ago was talking about how some of those dams are a
they
big
build up a
catcher
lot
of
sediment.
Yeah. Okay. Bobby.
Yeah, and the other thing would be is how this is going to affect us. Is there any effect us using silts to build our stock banks?
Yeah, I suppose there's the geotech issue around that, but that's certainly one of the solutions with acid sulfate soils or sediments is reburial, reinterment, and having a sort of cap over them, clay cap or.
And the what was the other one? Oh, you'd have to bring this to all of the especially to Hauraki when doing building consents in the Hauraki Plains, and you're either doing preloads or you're actually digging out to foundations and then reloading on a building there. You could be digging out 2 meters of peat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that where's all that? Because you're saying that's a contaminant now. So where's that actually been put?
Once you've neutralized, if you do neutralize it with lime, we wouldn't consider it contaminant.
No, but most probably that's just getting dug out and just dumped somewhere. Tell you the truth.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I guess what you need to worry about is that one day the lime doesn't become part and parcel of the upsetting of the groundwater.
Well, yeah, if you have to be careful about how much you lime the soils, because if you over lime it, then you've got the pH in the other direction, so you've got an issue there too. Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, you've got a big monitoring thing there. You've just opened a can of worms about use this, and then 5 years down the track, it's no good. Use something else. I'm glad I'm not a scientist.
On a dairy farm, it'd be pretty simple because you just get a muck spreader and you could spread it on and then just go and put half a ton of lime over it, and most probably it's resolved straight away. But it's just how you implement that in a cost-effective and a reasonable way of operating. But it isn't hard to work around. But it's just putting a common sense angle on it.
Yes. Yes.
Oh well, no more questions.
And that just to point out that the map, we are looking at further refinements because at the moment it's shown some quite large areas which are likely not to contain. That is just a higher risk area, so it's not likely that the whole area is.
Actually, your map doesn't show the dams on the Waikato River. Or if they do, I couldn't see it.
They're not in the high risk areas.
Yeah. Gosh, they've been there forever.
Yeah.
They've been there longer than some of these places have been farms, and you're saying it's no, okay. Well, then one day I might wake up and find those dams are on this asset run map, because I do know that the water from this to there or around dams are not considered as good as further up the river or something. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So I have a mover and a seconder, please. Bobby and awesome. I don't mind if you put me, somebody. Yep, me will do. Yes. Yep. Morena Korua. Before we move on and introduce yourself, I just want to understand what is terrestrial biodiversity before you get into the paperwork, and then I might be able to understand a lot about the paperwork because I know terrestrial for my mokas has certainly got nothing to do with.
So terrestrial is land-based. So we're not talking about freshwater, coastal.
I know.
Yep.
Yeah, but anyway, table's all yours.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Morena Councillors Chair. I'm Liz Overdyke. I'm an ecologist here in the science team at Council. Next slide, thanks. So thanks for having me here this morning to talk to you about terrestrial biodiversity monitoring. So this is our land-based ecosystems that I'm talking about. And as we know, there was a gap identified in our last State of the Environment reporting for the region around terrestrial biodiversity status and particular ecosystem health, reporting on our land-based ecosystems. So we have some LTP resources now to try and address this issue. And I'm just going to talk about how we'll be investigating existing data sources, which are available through council and through other agencies, and particularly establishing new monitoring to try and address this gap. Today I'm focused particularly on talking to you about a pilot that we've been running across the region this last summer, looking at establishing broad-scale terrestrial biodiversity monitoring across private land. Next slide, thanks. So a little bit of background for you is the sort of global and national direction that we have in biodiversity monitoring. We've got the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which New Zealand reports against. And we have our national strategy, Te Mana o Te Taio, which the Department of Conservation produces. And this provides an overarching framework for both public and private land and our biodiversity obligations. And then coming down to the regional level, we have a regional council framework for biodiversity assessment, which was published in 2011. And coming out of that, we had a document in 2016, which proposes 18 terrestrial biodiversity indicators that we can be looking at to assess our biodiversity outcomes within regions. And these frameworks all centre around ecological integrity at their centre. And there we're talking about Indigenous or native species dominance, species occupancy, and ecosystem representation. Sorry, I'm rushing through some of these points, but I think they're in your report. Next slide, thanks. When we look at the Department of Conservation and their biodiversity monitoring and reporting system, they use a system of 3 tiers to look at ecological health. And the 3 tiers represented there, you can see we've got tier 3 at the top, which looks at really intensive research-focused monitoring. And that might be issues such as in the Regional Council, we have Cody dieback as an issue that we might be monitoring really closely. Whereas tier 2, we might be looking at places where we're managing species or particular places, and we're wanting to monitor the effectiveness of that management that we're doing, for example, in our priority areas at the council. And then the third tier there, tier 1, is operating at a much broader scale, and that's where we're looking across the region at indicators for a regional picture and being able to put it in a national context. And that's where our state of the environment reporting is looking for those broader trends across the whole region. And that's where I'm focused on talking about today. Next slide, thanks. So coming back to that regional council framework, which was designed to provide a standardised and reliable framework for reporting on state of the environment and other statutory obligations of regional councils. Got the 18 indicators up there. Don't worry too much about the detail there. I'm just wanting to convey there, we have these 18 indicators across 4 broad areas grouped there. And different colours there, I've shown how we are reporting on those different indicators. So there are 4 green indicators where we are currently reporting, either at the regional or the national level. And then there are some orange indicators there where we're pretty much ready to report on those indicators. There are some limitations around that data. And then there are some indicators in white there where we have limitations around gathering data, access to data around those indicators, but we're working on those. And then there are 4 indicators in yellow, and that's where we can support those indicators through monitoring at that tier 1 level, and we have some standardised methods to be able to do that. So I'll come back in more detail to those. Next slide, thanks. So here we are with those 4 indicators that can be monitored at the broader scale. And we have the methodology which has been developed by the Department of Conservation and Ministry for the Environment. And this is called Tier 1 monitoring, a term that you'll hear me use a lot. This methodology is currently already used across public and private land to monitor vegetation, birds, also bats and pest animals, and look at the impact of those pests on the health of our native vegetation and animals. And currently this monitoring is done across an 8-kilometre grid network across the country. And let's go to the next slide, show you what that looks like. This 8-kilometre grid network is basically a survey site every 8 kilometres on a grid. And we've got 385 of those sites across the region. And already the red and yellow points there's 150 sites that are already measured by the Department of Conservation or Ministry for the Environment on public land or on private land where there's forest, because MFE are interested in forested sites for carbon storage. So there's an additional 230 plot sites there which all occur on private land or council-owned land, and that is where council could be contributing to monitoring using these standardised methods across the region. And so this summer, previous summer, we ran a pilot to establish plots using these methodologies on private land, and we looked at 16 sites for that pilot study. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more detail on what this actually means when you're at a site. So we've got vegetation being measured by the Ministry for the Environment and by the Department of Conservation, interested in different things. So they're looking at carbon storage. They're also interested in the plant composition and structure at those sites. And those vegetation sites have been monitored since 2002 on a lot of those sites. And then DOC are also undertaking additional animal measures at those sites on public conservation land. So they're also looking at birds, bats and pest mammals at those sites. And they've been doing that since 2011. Mm. So with that data already existing, council, has the option then to leverage off that information and establish sites across private land and those non-forest survey plots, and use both those methodologies, looking at vegetation and those animal measures. And that's what we did for our pilot. Next slide, thanks. This is what it looks like out on the ground. This is one of our pilot sites. We've got, when you're out there at your survey site, you've got your vegetation survey plot, which is 20 metres by 20 metres in the centre of your survey area. And then radiating off each of the corners of that vegetation plot, you've got your 220 metre transects where you're looking at your pest mammal presence and abundance, and you've got your 5-minute bird count stations at the end of each of those transects. And we've also had acoustic recorders out at each of those bird count stations and at the centre of the vegetation plot. And we have a bat recorder at the centre of the vegetation plot as well. At the bottom left photo there, you can see we've got a purple plastic round electronic marker ball, which we're burying in the ground. So at the corner of our vegetation plot, we are burying markers that we can go back and detect to remeasure exactly the same site. And we can detect that with our magic wand over the ground, and there's nothing left to get in the landowner's way. That's a real strength for this data, and that we can go back to exactly the same spot and know that any change that we observe is real change because we're measuring exactly the same site. Next slide, please. So just some pictures from our pilot study here. Our pilot study covered quite a range of land use and land covers, from really intensively managed dairy and cropping land cover to more rough or retired pasture, and often with some wetland elements at those sites. The animal lines radiating off those vegetation plots tended to have a more diverse land cover because we were spreading out around the area. And these will, then we would go through some land covers with higher stature vegetation present. Yep, next slide, thank you. And just briefly, some results as you were given in your report. First 3 bars on the graph there, we've got plant species. On average, we had 31 plant species per site, ranging with a really high range in number of plant species present per site, from 3 to 45. So quite a lot of variation between sites. Most of that diversity is in exotic plants. The photo on the right, you can see there's a 20 by 20 metre square laid out there in the pasture, and there's actually 43 plant species present within that 20 by 20 metre square, 8 of which were native species. You know, it can be quite surprising the number of species that you do find in a productive landscape where you might think there's not such diversity. When we look at the bird species, we found the second 3 bars on the graph there, also a predominance of introduced exotic species, but here the number of native birds was relatively higher compared to plants. And again, reasonably high diversity and quite a range between sites, with 17 bird species per site on average. Next slide, thanks. So we were looking at possum numbers as well. We were using chew cards, and we detected possums at 4 of the 16 sites. All of the sites where we detected possums were transects where there was forest habitat associated with those survey lines. And you can see the sites on that graph are all characterised by the land use at the site. Hares and rabbits were detected at most, if not all, sites using our pellet count methods. Next slide, thanks. So our pilot has been really useful. It's given us some learnings about using this methodology. We're implementing these plots and this methodology in a landscape that's quite fragmented and changing, whereas it was developed for use in much more landscapes with a much more consistent and contiguous forest. So we're getting quite a range of different land covers within each site. So we're making some adjustments to allow for that and to make sure that we incorporate that land cover information to be able to interpret our data at the end of the day. And this includes some things like increasing the number of bat recorders that we're deploying so that we can cover the landscape better. And we had some really useful records that we made at sites, not necessarily when we were within our plots making our records. There were some interesting records like the Honshu butterfly there, which we saw on the Waiho River, which was released there a few years ago, I believe, as a biocontrol agent for Japanese honeysuckle. We developed some pretty good skills in identification doing this work, and those are really useful skills for council to retain and nurture, especially in these productive landscapes, plant identification and bird identification. And we're also looking at developing some methods of electronic data capture where we can just have great efficiencies in bringing that data back into the office and save time. Next slide, thanks. So next steps for this broad scale monitoring. We'll be looking at implementing these plots across the region on a 5-year cycle. So it will take 5 years to establish all of the monitoring sites. And then we'll be remeasuring those on a constant cycle every 5 years. Every plot will be visited. The 5-year cycle was recommended by a recent review DOC have done on their Tier 1 monitoring plot network. And that allows us to actually detect those changes when they happen. If we spread the cycle out too much longer, it's harder to detect those trends close to when they happen. This coming summer, we'll be establishing some more sites, and we'll also be looking at trialling using those animal measures in forest plots where MFE have already established their vegetation carbon monitoring plots. So that vegetation data is already there. We'll continue to work with DOC and MFE and our landowners. Privacy commitments are a big thing with trying to share data between different organisations and working on private land, and that's something that we're continuing to work on. But we generally found that the reception we've got from landowners has been really positive to our biodiversity survey. We're also looking at how we can integrate this Tier 1 data with more focused Tier 2 data collection, where we're looking at how we can monitor more closely in those managed places and species, whether we might have increased sampling in certain areas where we're doing particular management, whether we might modify the method to suit different ecosystems, but to make sure that that data can be integrated together and we can leverage off both systems and off different agencies' data. We also might look at the potential for adding more variables to those plots, depending on the availability of methodology and time availability in the field. I've got one more slide, thank you. Just finishing on this slide here with some potential over what this data can look like over time. This example here has got a couple of images from Greater Wellington's reporting, their State of the Environment Terrestrial Biodiversity reporting. They have been implementing these Tier 1 plots for the last 10 years. So they have visited all of their sites twice, and they're now able to talk about change in those sites. And they're able to look at Indigenous plant species or bird species, and in those images there, they're showing whether species numbers are increasing, decreasing, staying the same. They've combined data from their regional network with MFE and DOC's data on public land and forested land, so they've got a picture across the whole region. And they've got a bit of a review and big analysis underway with their data at the moment, and so we'll be looking to benefit from what they find from that. And so, yeah, I just think this sort of data gathering is really important on the ground for us to be able to measure the spatial and temporal patterns, which may or may not happen over time, but we won't know until we actually gather that baseline data. And some things such as longer term climate change responses by native species or by invasive pest species can be captured by establishing this type of monitoring. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Questions? Bruce?
Yeah. Hello, Liz. Can you tell me, so none of the plots that you did in your pilot were remeasurements, right?
No, they're all new plots being.
Yeah, they're all new plots, because I was trying to get a handle on the data you presented in the report about there were approximately 150 plots on private land, and some of those have been measured previously for the Lucas system.
Yep. So that 150, that includes public conservation land and private land. I think about 70 of those are on private land. They've been measured for vegetation.
So what was that number again? The number that had been measured on
It's
private
around
land?
70, and that includes natural forest and planted forest as well.
Yeah. Okay. Because I'm just trying to get a sense of, so why did you select the plots that you measured?
So that was a random selection. So the way that the grid network is laid out, there is a set grouping for plots in years. So on that 5-year cycle, you already have a set group of plots that you would be looking at measuring. And that grouping has been set so that you have councils, you have DOC and you have MFE all measuring the same group each year so that you know who's doing what. So we picked the 10-year group, which is a smaller group than a 5-year group because we knew we didn't have the capacity to do a 5-year group. So it is a random selection across the region. So the way that grouping is designed also is that every year you have a random selection, so you can actually look at a year's data and that gives you a random sample that can be looked at on its own. Statistically.
So have any plots on private land been remeasured?
Yes, yes.
So
yes, definitely.
So what, approximately how many?
So MFE have been measuring those plots since 2002, and they started on a 5-year cycle and then they moved to a 10-year cycle. So some of those sites will have 3 or 4 remeasures on them.
Yeah, because that's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
What can we already know about the rates of change and the type of change that's occurring on that landscape? So, and I mean, just looking at your map too, I understand the notion, the statistical importance of the random selection, but when you look at the map, your map of where you've sampled, can we show that map again? Yeah, that's the one.
Yep.
While it's a random selection, it's spatially very confined to certain parts of the region.
Yeah, it was really unfortunate that we actually had, there were 3 sites and they all fell down the west coast that we couldn't get access to for several reasons. So there would have been more representation on the western side there if we had accessed 3. So there were 3 sites that we couldn't get access to. In that,
well, that sort of takes me to my last quick question. So you made some comments about landowner reaction to, and you've just told us about some sites where you couldn't get access. But is there any research at the same time that you're doing this work, which is more from a social science point of view? Is there, I mean, when you say the reaction was generally good, is that just your impression, or is it based on an appropriate style, either qualitative or quantitative survey?
That's our impression from our conversations with landowners. They are genuinely interested, mostly interested in getting that information back to them. And so we are also producing reports that we can give back to the landowners because although we have to be very careful to let them know that we are gathering this data on a real broad scale, so it's only just a very small snapshot of a small area for their property, but it does give them valuable information, and then they're just interested in knowing what we've found. But you can't really interpret this data on a property scale because it's designed to be collected across a network, because you can see with that variation that we had between sites, it's huge, and so you need big sample numbers of plots to actually interpret the data.
Oh, look, thank you very much for the report, and yeah, it's great to see some progress. But I will come back at some stage. I'd love to know the results of remeasurements. Really like to know if there is any glimpse at the moment of what the trends are.
Yep. We have to be in it for the long haul. We have to get this started to get some remeasurements going, but we do have that information. MFE holds that information, and it's not straightforward for us to just say, hey, can we have that data? Which,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Warren.
Yeah, thank you, Katarina. Understanding your financial constraints that you're under, and have we looked at the ability of the increase in technology and stuff around AI and the ability to perhaps analyse some of the information that's coming back in from the field and where that future may lead, or if there are any other organisations using AI and what they're doing in the same space?
Yes, there is a lot going on in that AI space in terms of trying to be able to identify the health of forests in terms of the actual bulk of canopy and biomass, and can you tell if you've got pest impacts defoliating your forest? Can you use imagery, satellite imagery? Yes, there is work progressing there, but what that work really needs is on the ground field data to support it and to train it. And I guess that's where this program comes in, is we're trying to provide some of that field base to support what we're seeing, at the moment we're reporting from satellite imagery, from desktop analysis, but we need to actually back that up with on the ground data. But it is definitely an area that is moving. Yeah.
I just imagined a drone flying over your test space, and bringing it back to an analysis through an AI program that says, okay, oh yeah, we have got 42 plant species in that square.
Gosh, wouldn't that be lovely? Yes, we're, you pick your bit of grass and you're looking to see these tiny little, you're using your lens to try and tell what species it is. And one day we might get to that point, but I think botanists are still secure in their jobs, but using drones and things is certainly could be useful on that more landscape scale. Yeah. Good.
Yes, Madam Chair. Could we go to the second to last slide? That's the last one. Yeah, so that established plots on a 5-year cycle. So does that mean you're going to do another 230 in total? Is that your intention?
So that means there's that 230 number. They all get measured within 5 years. So there's a group. So within that 5 years, we're measuring maybe 45 plots per year. And then when we get to year 6, we start again and we start remeasuring the ones year 1. So, yeah.
And so it's just in relation to resourcing. So it's resourced for next year.
Yeah.
But does that mean you're coming back to the council for more funding? Because on page 86, the Golder has estimated it's $1 million to do the 264 sites.
So we have a new position starting this year, and that's helping us to trial some more measures this summer. And then we are resourced ready for this program to work on that 5-year cycle.
Okay, so there's $1 million allocated in the LTP for this.
Not each year, so but across the LTP. So yeah, we have sufficient resources come 2025 to get close to that 5-year cycle and doing those 45 plots a year. So thank you very much for your support through that LTP process. We are gradually ramping up to be able to deliver that tier 1 process, as Liz has mentioned.
I don't recall this in the LTP. I don't know if specifically if it was mentioned.
Yeah, it was.
So MFE and DOC are also facing cutbacks at the moment. Is it likely that they will pull out of some of their program?
We can't discount that, but they have the same obligations for reporting national level. So that's decisions that they have to make, but they have obligations to gather this data as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, another move in a second, please. Yep. Thanks, Bruce. And we'll give a second. Yep. And they can't find any. there's a whole lot of papers at the back of all of this if you guys want to, if you guys want them, and I'm sure if you want them separated in your own little file, we can get that as well. So yeah, the next one. So you got a very short paper there, and maybe we'll take it. We've got lots of time, but maybe we'll take it as read. And if you've got some highlights of points you might want to do in this lot, it'll be great. And then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. So I didn't get to introduce myself. Morning, Councillor and Chairs. I'm Michelle Begbie. I'm a contaminated land scientist by trade. I'm a team leader in the science section. So Liz is in my team, as is Jonathan. And I'll just quickly introduce you to Joshua Evans. Put your hand up, Josh. And Caitlin Morrison. So these are two more recent members of our team, and I hope you don't mind. I brought them along today to help them see what a council meeting, committee meeting is like. So hopefully you will see them one day presenting their own knowledge. Yeah, so this paper today is an update that was requested from Councillor Graf about a 2022 report that Jonathan and I presented to this committee around the Parliamentary Commissioner report, Knowing What's Out There. So that report made a number of recommendations about our state of knowledge in New Zealand around the use and application of chemicals to the land. Of relevance, and I'll just be very brief here because you have gone over time and you've been wonderful listening to all of our team. We're very grateful for that. Of relevance to the Regional Council is our ability to deliver effective policy and effective state of the environment monitoring. So we can't really target state of the environment monitoring unless we know what chemicals are being applied where and in what cases, what intensity, seasonality, etc. We don't know where to go and look for these things. Some of the agrochemicals and horticultural chemicals that are used are quite expensive analyses. So having a framework, which the PCE report recommended around volumes of use, would be really useful for us to target more effectively our state of the environment monitoring. And then the second part is understanding the toxicity and the use of these chemicals. So we have a suite of permitted activity rules in our policy that allow people to use these amendments as they need to, but unless there is a really good framework which understands the toxicity of these things and has conditions around their approvals and use, then we can't be sure that our policy is sufficiently protective of the environment. So those were the main reasons that report was brought to this committee, and Councillor Graf asked for an update on what has happened in that space around those regulations and those the recommendations for new regulation. And I can assure you that my report is very short because very little has happened in that space. However, there is a change now that from 2026, manufacturers and importers will be required to record volumes and report on volumes. That doesn't really help us here in the region because it's national numbers, doesn't really tell us where those things are being used and what their intensity might be. And the other update was around seeds and the coatings on them. Previously, they'd been considered as manufactured articles, but of course that then allows the possibility that we're importing products with chemicals in them that we have not approved for use yet in New Zealand. So that's a little bit outside the scope of the Regional Council. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the change in the sector that we would have liked to have seen, but I'm here to answer any questions you might have and in response to that councillor query. Thank you.
Good, Michelle. Questions? You shocked us.
It was wonderful that councillors are still interested in the progress of these things, but it was slightly disheartening to bring you such a brief report.
Robbie.
Yeah, and as ICM issue, I think we've already brought this up, is I forget what the product's called, but we're using it for alligator weed. And also the issue that landowners are using that in their own drains. And then we're getting to the maximum level for that catchment because it's been used into us and landowners. So I think that's one of the things.
That's right.
We've had that problem in ICM. So as a contaminant.
And I can confirm that Jonathan is working with our biosecurity team to advise them and support them in that.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. And I'm not going to presume what Clyde was talking about, but I can imagine that one of them would be our association with DOC and their usage of 1080. So, you know, that we all know that that would have been one of the korero that he would have wanted to know about because we've always said that we don't disperse it, but we do help DOC in some areas. So keeping tabs on what we do around there will be good. Because you're always going to get some for it and some against. So we have to have that balanced conversation and understanding. Come on, Michelle. Yeah. Robbie.
I know this has hit me and Bruce in the face a couple of times, but contaminant from Roundup in drains as well with fish kill and frog kill. So it's a biodiversity issue. You've met, hey Bruce, you've been asked about that as well. So there is that going on in the catchments because that becomes an issue in another way of that we're getting landowners wanting to go, geez, you're too expensive at cleaning the board drains. We want to start doing them ourselves. So how much Roundup is actually getting used and what other chemicals could be used in that spray than just Roundup. So I'd just like to put that out there that's another discussion that's going to happen in the near future.
So I can imagine, Michelle, if some of the stuff that we're talking about, you quite know what they are because of the chemical components.
Yes, and I think possibly what you're talking to a little bit there is I guess we haven't got a great track record in this country of setting environmental exposure limits, and that's really what we need. And mentioned also in that report is that central government have announced a regulatory review into the approvals process. So on the one hand, here we are at regional council saying, if we had good environmental exposure limits, we could set decent policy around permitted activity use, et cetera, we could target our state of the environment monitoring, therefore we would know when our approvals and controls aren't being effective. But on the other hand, we have central government who are launching a regulatory review into the approvals process with a view, which they have made very publicly clear, to simplifying and hastening the process to get new chemicals approved for use. So there's tension everywhere, right? But that's something that our staff will be watching closely to see what impact that might have on our abilities to deliver our function.
So you raise a good point, Robbie, which is why it's really important that our science team, when they're out doing the state of the environment monitoring, if they identify issues such as what is being referred to today, they can be, we may not yet have a regulatory regime to manage, but that doesn't mean that we can't do a bunch of the things that Jack was talking about earlier about going out and informing and educating people about what does good practice look like. Because most people want to do the right thing when they know what the right thing is, whilst we await a regulatory regime. So that's why it's really keen that all the various different parts of the council talking about that topic.
If we're just assessing the effect, then we know what could be happening. But if we're not assessing the effect, then what is happening? What is causing it? We don't know.
And that's that SOE monitoring program that the science team are spending a lot of time working on.
Kia ora. Bruce.
Yeah, so, and of course, we're all aware that Jen is constantly reminding us of new contaminants. And so the future focus that is needed to be alert to the fact that there's a range of new contaminants appearing in our environment, which no one is monitoring at all, except the odd university student, I think. Microplastics, all sorts of stuff that's finding its way into food webs, has potential to interfere with organism development, all sorts of stuff. And we sort of have a set list of the ones we know, but I'm not sure we're focusing enough on the new ones that are arriving on the scene. So I'm sure the guys and the team over there, I'm sure they are looking forward. I'm hoping they are, yeah.
Okay, well, that seems to be us, Michelle. Thank you. Thank you to all of those behind you as well for coming to our hui and presenting where you had to, and everyone else in the room. So any last comments, Koto? You make it, Michelle, around our table? All good? No? Okay. Yeah, long ones too. So we'll finish this off with a karakia. Did you want to do it? Yeah, I'm happy to do it. Okay. E noi tātou. Unihia mai te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te hinanaro. I te ara takutu koiara e rongo, e whakaairia ake ki runga, kia tina huie tai ki e. Thank you, Dave. And Brent.